and it frightened her a little. It was one of Miss Marple's strongest convictions that truth rarely arrived dramatically. It crept instead, a phrase overheard carelessly, a contradiction too small for anyone else to notice, a gesture repeated unconsciously. Human beings betrayed themselves in fragments long before they confessed in words. On Thursday morning Miss Marple awoke with the distinct feeling that something important had already been explained to her, though not directly. She sat upright in bed at once. "A canary," she murmured aloud. After several moments she began to laugh softly to herself. Diana, entering later with breakfast, found her aunt unusually alert. "You've solved something." "Partly." "Why?" Miss Marple accepted tea absently. "My dear, do you remember Mrs. Cartwright's canary in St. Mary Mead?" Diana sighed faintly. Experience had taught her this question might precede anything from burglary to horticulture. Vaguely, "Yellow bird," sang beautifully. Mrs. Cartwright insisted the cat killed it. Miss Marple stirred sugar thoughtfully. But the bird had actually died 2 days earlier. "I fail entirely to see." "Exactly," said Miss Marple brightly. "No one noticed because the cage remained covered." Diana stared. "Aunt Jane, what has this to do with murder?" "Everything." Miss Marple sipped tea. "People observe events only after attention has been directed toward them. Before that they often see nothing at all." Diana gave up. This too was experience. Late that morning Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Haydock. She found him in his surgery wrestling unsuccessfully with paperwork. "You look pleased with yourself," he remarked suspiciously. "I am. That's worrying." Miss Marple seated herself comfortably. "My dear doctor, may I ask a rather unpleasant question?" "With you they generally are." "The poison?" Haydock sighed. "Yes?" "You said arsenic caused death almost immediately?" "Within minutes." "And symptoms would have been obvious?" "Certainly." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then Ambrose Vale knew he had been poisoned." "Obviously." "And yet," she said softly, "he made no accusation." Haydock frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, if a man suddenly collapses after tea at a crowded fete, one expects him to cry out something useful. My tea, perhaps, or help, even Elspeth. But according to witnesses, he said nothing." The doctor blinked. "That's true. He simply staggered behind the tent." Haydock leaned back slowly. "You think he knew who poisoned him?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "And more importantly, I think he understood why." The doctor stared at her. "Good Lord." Miss Marple continued knitting calmly. "There is another point also. Inspector Graves assumes the poison entered the tea immediately before serving. But arsenic possesses a rather noticeable taste." "Yes." "Unless," said Miss Marple gently, "the victim had consumed it before." A long silence followed. Then Haydock said carefully, "You're suggesting the tea merely finished what had already begun?" "Possibly." The doctor rose abruptly. "I must re-examine the timing." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I believe you must." That afternoon Marlicombe received another shock. Police searching Ambrose Vale's study discovered financial documents indicating severe debt. The revelation spread through the village with almost indecent enthusiasm. "But he seems so wealthy." "They always do." "I heard he lost everything abroad." No wonder Miss Grove broke the engagement. At the Blue Boar that evening speculation reached near festive levels. Colonel Bantry growled into his whiskey. "Whole village has turned into a flock of crows." Miss Marple, seated nearby, replied mildly, "Crows are very intelligent birds." Gerald. Pike occupied his usual place near the fireplace, though tonight his charm seemed strained at the edges. He laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, and glanced repeatedly toward the inn door whenever it opened. Miss Marple noticed every instance. Fear was exhausting him. Mrs. Finch leaned toward Miss Marple confidentially. "There's more gossip now about the greenhouse." "Oh?" "Apparently Mr. Vale kept papers hidden there." "What sort of papers?" "No one knows exactly." Mrs. Finch lowered her voice further. "But Mrs. Baker swears she saw lights there after midnight last week." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Indeed?" "Yes, and someone walking near the rose beds." "Man or woman?" "Oh, impossible to say." Miss Marple resumed knitting thoughtfully. A few moments later Gerald Pike crossed toward the bar. As he passed, something slipped unnoticed from his coat pocket onto the carpet near Miss Marple's chair. A key. Brass. Unusual. Miss Marple bent carefully and retrieved it before anyone else observed. Pike had already reached the bar. She examined the key discreetly beneath her shawl. Stamped upon it were 3 letters. GH2. Greenhouse 2. Number. Rosebank possessed only one greenhouse. Miss Marple slipped the key quietly into her handbag. Then she looked up. Across the crowded inn Gerald Pike had suddenly frozen. He knew. Not how much she understood, perhaps, but enough to realize something had gone wrong. Their eyes met briefly. For one fraction of a second all charm vanished from his face. What remained beneath it was naked desperation. Then the expression disappeared. He smiled again, but too late. Miss Marple had seen the truth hidden underneath. Later that night she sat alone beside Diana's drawing-room fire while the household slept. The brass key rested upon the table beside her teacup. Outside, wind moved softly through the hedges. Miss Marple's thoughts arranged themselves carefully now. Ambrose Vale had been frightened before his death. Someone had searched the greenhouse. Someone had set fire to it. Someone continued searching afterward. And Gerald Pike was terrified. Not of murder itself, of discovery. Miss Marple picked up the key once more. GH2. Suddenly another memory stirred. Not a canary this time. Suddenly another memory stirred. Not a canary this time. A boarding-house in Bournemouth nearly 20 years earlier. A respectable widow keeping duplicate keys hidden inside labeled envelopes. Miss Marple sat very still. Then slowly she smiled. "My goodness," she murmured. The key was not for a place. It was for a deposit box. The discovery delighted Inspector Graves enormously. By Friday morning the police had identified the meaning of the brass key. Miss Marple, after a quiet telephone conversation with Dr. Haydock, who possessed a cousin at the Much Benham branch bank, learned that G.H.2 referred indeed to a private deposit box. Its contents had now been examined officially, and among them were letters, a great many letters. Inspector Graves arrived at Diana Harmon's cottage shortly after luncheon with the air of a man carrying triumph in his coat pocket. "Well," he announced heavily, removing damp gloves, "things are considerably clearer now." "Are they?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. The inspector ignored the tone. "We've uncovered correspondence proving Ambrose Vale was blackmailing several individuals." Diana gasped. "Blackmail?" Graves looked grimly satisfied. "Financial pressure explains everything." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "And whom was he blackmailing?" The inspector hesitated fractionally. "Among others, Gerald Pike." "Interesting," thought Miss Marple. "Very interesting indeed." Aloud she merely said, "How unfortunate." Graves began pacing before the fire. Pike owed large gambling debts. Vale apparently held documents connected to fraudulent business dealings overseas, and Mr. Pike feared exposure. "Exactly." The inspector stopped dramatically. "We arrested him this morning," Diana exclaimed softly. Miss Marple did not move. Inspector Graves watched her almost resentfully. "Well?" "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "you sound disappointed that I am not astonished. You think I am wrong again." "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that you are nearer the truth than before." Graves frowned, but not at it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Murder investigations resemble knitting. One may possess the correct wool and still produce the wrong pattern." The inspector made an impatient sound. "Pike lied repeatedly about his finances. Witnesses place him near the greenhouse before the fire. And he admits quarreling with Vale privately 2 days before the fete." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I expect he did. You still doubt him?" "Ah, Mr. Pike is certainly guilty of something." Graves blinked. "Something?" "My dear Inspector, criminals often overlap untidily. It complicates matters enormously." Before he could press further, the maid entered carrying a note. For Miss Marple, the handwriting was unfamiliar once again. Miss Marple opened it quietly. This time the message read, "He knew before the tea. Ask about the photograph. No signature." Diana looked alarmed. Another anonymous note? Inspector Graves held out his hand immediately. "I'll take that." Miss Marple surrendered it without protest. The inspector read it, scowling. Rubbish. Someone enjoying melodrama. "Possibly," said Miss Marple. Yet inwardly her thoughts sharpened instantly. The photograph. What photograph? And why did the anonymous writer assume she would understand? By evening the arrest of Gerald Pike had transformed Malacombe completely. Some villagers reacted with relief, others with outrage. Mrs. Finch declared tearfully that she had always distrusted fashionable moustaches. Colonel Bantry considered Pike a slippery young devil from the start. Meanwhile Pamela. Reed wept openly in the post office, insisting Gerald was incapable of violence because he danced exceptionally well. Miss Marple reflected that women had excused alarming behavior for far less impressive reasons. At the Blue Boar that night conversation swelled louder than ever. "You see," Mrs. Giles proclaimed triumphantly, "foreign business dealings. I said from the beginning there was something continental about him." No one asked precisely what that meant. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed corner, while listening to the tide of gossip rise and shift around her. Only one person in the inn seemed untouched by excitement. Mrs. Elspeth Grove. She sat alone near the far window, dressed again in grey, untouched sherry before her, observing the room with calm exhaustion. Miss Marple crossed to join her. "You are not pleased by Mr. Pike's arrest," she observed softly. Elspeth looked up. "No." "You believe him innocent?" A pause. "I believe Gerald weak." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Weakness often leads people into terrible situations." "He lied," Elspeth said quietly. "He borrowed money. He pretended success where there was none. But murder." She shook her head. "No." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You cared for him." Elspeth's expression altered faintly. "Not as you mean." "No?" "He was lonely," she said simply, "and frightened of Ambrose." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Why frightened?" Again that hesitation. Then Elspeth said in a low voice, "Because Ambrose collected people's secrets." The fire crackled softly nearby. Miss Marple remembered suddenly Mrs. Finch's description. He observed people instead of caring for them. That sounded precisely right. "Did he blackmail you also?" asked Miss Marple gently. Elspeth met her gaze steadily. "No." "You are certain?" There had been no fear in her answer, only bitterness. At that moment the inn door opened sharply. Inspector Graves entered accompanied by Sergeant Miller. Conversation dropped instantly. Graves crossed directly toward Miss Marple. "We've found additional evidence," he announced. The entire room leaned inward invisibly. "What sort?" asked Colonel Bantry. "A photograph." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. The inspector continued with satisfaction. "It was hidden in Pike's rooms. Shows him arguing violently with Vale beside the greenhouse the night of the fire." Murmurs spread immediately. "But there's more," Graves said. Murmurs spread immediately. "But there's more," Graves said. "The photograph was taken secretly." Miss Marple sat very still. "Secretly?" "Yes." "Someone photographed them through the greenhouse glass." A curious silence followed. Then Miss Marple asked quietly, "Who developed the picture?" Inspector Graves blinked. "Why?" "The photograph," repeated Miss Marple. "Who developed it?" "Local chemist in Much Benham." "And when?" 2 days before the fete." Miss Marple's knitting slipped suddenly from her lap. Not dramatically, only a small movement, but enough for Elspeth Grove beside her to glance over sharply. Because Miss Marple, for the first time since the murder, looked genuinely disturbed. Very softly she said, "My dear Inspector, did it not strike you as odd?" "What?" "That someone secretly photographing blackmail and threats," said Miss Marple, "should then keep the evidence hidden instead of immediately using it." Graves frowned. "Well, perhaps they feared involvement." Perhaps, but Miss Marple no longer believed that. Something cold had touched the edges of her thoughts now. Something patient, careful. A photograph secretly taken. Anonymous notes. Evidence appearing at convenient moments. Not panic. Not improvisation. And suddenly she knew with absolute certainty that the murderer had planned far more than one death. Miss Marple slept badly that night. This in itself was unusual. She generally maintained that advancing age possessed certain advantages, among them the ability to sleep peacefully through thunderstorms, church bells, and most human foolishness. But now her mind moved restlessly from one detail to another, fitting fragments together while something essential still refused to settle into place. The photograph troubled her most, not because of what it showed men quarreled every day, but because of the mind behind it. Someone had hidden it deliberately. Someone had waited, and someone had guided the investigation with anonymous notes like breadcrumbs scattered carefully through a wood. That implied calculation of a particularly dangerous sort. By morning Miss Marple had reached a conclusion. She must see the photograph herself. Inspector Graves received her at the Much Benham police station with visible reluctance. "I cannot allow civilians to interfere indefinitely," he complained, while leading her toward his office. "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "at my age interference becomes almost the only recreation available." He made an exasperated sound. The photograph lay upon his desk beside several typed reports. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined it carefully. The image showed the greenhouse terrace at night, lit faintly from within. Gerald Pike stood half-turned toward Ambrose Vale, one hand raised angrily. Vale himself appeared blurred but unmistakable. At first glance the scene seemed incriminating enough. At second glance less so. Miss Marple studied it silently. "Curious," she murmured. Graves folded his arms. "What now?" "The angle. What about it?" "The photograph was taken from very low down." The inspector frowned. "So?" "Well," said Miss Marple gently, "unless the photographer happened to be unusually short, they were probably crouching." "That proves nothing." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "but it suggests fear of being seen." Graves tapped the desk impatiently. "Anyone secretly taking photographs would hide." "Certainly. Yet there is another small matter." "What matter?" Miss Marple pointed delicately. "The greenhouse glass." The inspector stared. "It reflects light from inside." "And?" "Which means," said Miss Marple softly, "the photographer could not have seen clearly from outside unless standing very near the window." Graves blinked. Miss Marple continued. "Close enough, in fact, to risk immediate discovery." The inspector frowned harder. "You think the photographer knew Vale wouldn't notice?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "the photographer may not have feared him." A silence followed. Then Graves said reluctantly, "You really believe these anonymous notes come from the killer?" "Possibly. Why help us at all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, some murderers enjoy superiority. They wish not merely to escape punishment, but to direct the story itself." That thought seemed to discomfort him visibly. Good, Miss Marple reflected. Discomfort encouraged thought. As she rose to leave, her eyes moved once more across the desk, then stopped. Beside the photograph lay another object partly concealed beneath papers. A dried rose, dark crimson, nearly black at the edges. Miss Marple's expression sharpened instantly. "Inspector, where did that come from?" Graves looked down carelessly. "Oh, that—" "Found pressed inside one of Vale's account books. May I?" He handed it over. Miss Marple examined the flower carefully. The petals had retained a faint smoky scent even now, ashen beauty. But tied around the stem was something almost invisible, a fine strand of grey silk. Very fine, like thread from expensive clothing. Miss Marple became very still. On her return journey to Marlicombe she stopped unexpectedly at the village dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Phelps looked astonished. "Miss Marple, how lovely!" "My dear Mrs. Phelps," said Miss Marple, "I wonder whether you might satisfy an old woman's curiosity." 20 minutes later she emerged thoughtful, very thoughtful indeed. That afternoon brought fresh excitement. Gerald Pike had attempted escape. The news spread through the village before tea. According to Sergeant Miller, Pike tried leaving through a rear corridor during questioning at the station. He had been stopped immediately, though not before creating a dramatic scene involving overturned chairs and a bruised constable. To Inspector Graves this confirmed guilt entirely. To Miss Marple it suggested something else. Fear again. Always fear. Not the cold confidence of a calculating poisoner. The reaction of a trapped man. She found Colonel Bantry waiting outside the post office bursting with indignation. "Fellow nearly bolted outright," he exclaimed, with indignation. "Fellow nearly bolted outright," he exclaimed. "Damning behavior." "Yes," said Miss Marple absently. "Surely you admit it now." "My dear Colonel, innocent people flee surprisingly often." "What nonsense." "Oh, no." One recalls poor Edith Simpkins in St. Mary Mead. Ran away entirely after Mrs. Bartlett's pearls vanished. Everyone assumed guilt. Turned out she merely feared publicity because she'd secretly dyed her hair. The Colonel stared helplessly. "I cannot follow your reasoning at all." "Very few people do," Miss Marple admitted cheerfully. As they walked together through the square, she noticed movement at the upstairs window of Rosebank Hall. A figure in grey. Elspeth Grove. Watching the village below. Watching everything. Miss Marple slowed slightly. Then another thought occurred to her so abruptly that she stopped altogether. The silk thread. Very fine. And Mrs. Phelps had confirmed only one woman in Marlicombe regularly purchased that quality fabric. Miss Marple looked again toward the distant window. Elspeth Grove stood motionless behind the glass, not frightened, not grieving, waiting. For perhaps 5 seconds Miss Marple experienced the rare and unpleasant sensation of having misunderstood something profoundly. Then, quietly, "Oh dear," she murmured. Colonel Bantry glanced down. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because for the first time she was beginning to suspect that the person everyone believed most vulnerable in Marleycombe might actually be the most dangerous person there. Miss Marple disliked changing her mind, not from pride exactly, but because experience had taught her that first impressions, while frequently incomplete, were seldom entirely wrong. Elspeth Grove had not struck her as a poisoner. She still did not. Yet something about the woman troubled her now in a deeper and more complicated way. Not guilt, perhaps. Knowledge. And knowledge, Miss Marple reflected, could be almost as dangerous as murder itself. The following afternoon she accepted an invitation to tea at Rosebank Hall. The invitation had arrived by hand upon thick cream stationery. "Dear Miss Marple, I believe there are matters we should discuss privately. Yours sincerely, Elspeth Grove." No explanation accompanied it. Miss Marple went at once. The day had turned warm again. Sunlight lay across the terraces where late roses drooped heavily in the heat, their scent rich almost to excess. Rosebank Hall appeared peaceful from a distance, too peaceful. Inside, the atmosphere remained strained beneath its polished surface. Servants moved carefully. Doors closed softly. One felt instinctively that everyone in the house listened for things unsaid. Elspeth received her not in the morning-room this time, but in the library. It was a handsome room lined with dark shelves and French windows opening onto the west garden. Ambrose Vale's presence lingered everywhere still. Immaculate arrangement, expensive cigarettes upon a tray, a silver letter-opener precisely aligned beside untouched correspondence. Miss Marple noticed another detail immediately. The photograph on the mantelpiece had been turned face down. "You wish to speak with me," she said gently as she sat. Elspeth poured tea herself. Again those perfectly steady hands. For several moments neither woman spoke. Then Elspeth said quietly, "You suspect me now." Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. "I suspect," she replied, "that you know considerably more than you have told Inspector Graves." A faint smile touched Elspeth's mouth. "That is true." Outside the open windows bees moved lazily among the roses. Miss Marple waited. Finally Elspeth rose and crossed toward the mantelpiece. She picked up the overturned photograph frame and handed it silently across. It showed Ambrose Vale beside the greenhouse, smiling toward the camera. Beside him stood a woman. Not Elspeth. The photograph had been partially torn through, removing most of the woman's face, but enough remained. A pale hand, dark hair, grey silk sleeves. Miss Marple became very still. "When was this taken?" she asked softly. "Last winter." "And the woman?" Elspeth returned slowly to her chair. "I don't know her name." Miss Marple lifted her eyes sharply. "You expect me to believe that?" "It's the truth." Elspeth's voice remained calm. Ambrose was careful. Women appeared and disappeared continually. He preferred secrets. Miss Marple looked again at the torn photograph. Why tear away her face? "I didn't." A silence followed. Then Elspeth added quietly, "Ambrose did." Miss Marple felt a faint chill despite the warmth. "Why?" "Because she threatened him." Now they approached truth at last. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "The greenhouse fire," she said softly. "It concerned this woman." Elspeth did not answer immediately. Outside, a rook called harshly somewhere beyond the terrace. "He kept letters there," Elspeth said. "Documents. Photographs. Enough to ruin people. Blackmail material." "And the woman wanted them destroyed?" Elspeth's expression altered faintly. "No." Miss Marple waited. "She wanted something returned." "Why?" "I don't know." That, Miss Marple thought, might actually be true. Did Gerald Pike know about her? And fear her? For the first time genuine emotion crossed Elspeth's face. Not fear. Gerald fears everyone stronger than himself. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Again true. There came suddenly the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy. Male. Both women turned instinctively toward the door. But the footsteps passed by without stopping. Elspeth exhaled quietly. "You are frightened," Miss Marple observed. "Shouldn't I be?" "Possibly." The younger woman stared toward the windows. "You know what the strange thing is," she said after a moment. "Everyone thinks murder changes everything, but mostly it only reveals what was already there." Miss Marple looked at her sharply. That was an extraordinarily perceptive remark, perhaps too perceptive. "My dear Mrs. Grove," she said gently, "did you love Ambrose Vale?" The question seemed to Grove, she said gently, "Did you love Ambrose Vale?" The question seemed to surprise her. "No." "Did you ever?" Elspeth considered a long moment. "I loved who he pretended to be." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "That happens very often." At that instant the library door opened abruptly. Inspector Graves entered. He stopped short upon seeing Miss Marple. "Oh," he said heavily. "You again." "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "how fortunate we all are to remain alive long enough for repeated meetings." Graves ignored this. He turned directly to Elspeth. "I've come with further questions." Elspeth's face closed at once. "About Gerald?" "Partly." The inspector hesitated. "We've discovered something else." Miss Marple watched him carefully. He looked uneasy. Not triumphant this time. Uneasy. "What sort of thing?" asked Elspeth quietly. Graves removed a folded paper from his pocket. A second deposit box. Silence fell instantly. The inspector continued. "Opened yesterday evening in Exeter under a false name. Inside we found several documents and a passport." Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. "A passport?" she repeated softly. Graves nodded grimly. "In the name of Ambrose Vale." A long pause followed. "But Ambrose Vale is dead," said Elspeth. "Yes," replied the inspector slowly. "That," said Miss Marple very quietly, "is precisely what troubles me." For several moments after Inspector Graves spoke, nobody moved at all. The late afternoon sunlight slanted across the library carpet. Somewhere outside a gardener's shears clipped rhythmically among the roses. Ordinary sounds, ordinary light. Yet suddenly the room felt altered, because a dead man did not prepare passports under false names unless he intended either escape or deception. Inspector Graves cleared his throat heavily. "The passport photograph is definitely Vale," he said. "Different moustache, different hairstyle, but unquestionably him." Elspeth sat perfectly still. "When was it issued?" 3 weeks ago." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly in her lap. "Very interesting indeed. Was there money in the deposit box?" she asked. "Some." Graves frowned. "Foreign currency, railway timetables, a ferry schedule from Southampton, and the false name, Arthur Lenton." Miss Marple repeated it softly. "Arthur Lenton." The name meant nothing immediately, yet something about it disturbed her faintly, like a remembered tune one could not quite place. Inspector Graves began pacing again. "We now believe Vale planned to leave England." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Possibly because Pike threatened exposure." "Possibly." The inspector frowned irritably. "You sound unconvinced again." "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "one may prepare escape plans without intending immediate departure. Human beings enjoy preserving options." Graves snorted. "You make everything complicated." "No," replied Miss Marple softly. "People do." Elspeth rose suddenly and crossed toward the window. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that England bored him." Both turned toward her. "He said villages were full of small minds and long memories." Her mouth tightened slightly. "I think he hated being ordinary." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "I expect he did." There followed a brief silence. Then Miss Marple asked, "Inspector, was anything else found in the second box?" Graves hesitated. "A letter." "To whom?" "No name." He removed folded papers reluctantly. "But it appears unfinished." He handed it across. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read. "If matters become difficult, the arrangement remains unchanged. The photographs are secure. Gerald suspects nothing, though Elspeth grows troublesome. Once I leave, there will be no further reason for anxiety." The letter ended abruptly there, unsigned. Miss Marple read it twice, then once more. Something about the tone troubled her profoundly. Not fear, always control. "Was this written recently?" she asked. "Likely within the last week." Miss Marple handed back the paper slowly. "And no indication who received it?" "None." Elspeth spoke suddenly from the window. "He was writing to her." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "The woman in the photograph?" Inspector Graves frowned. "What woman?" Elspeth hesitated only briefly before retrieving the torn photograph from the mantelpiece and handing it over. Graves stared. "Why the devil didn't you show me this earlier?" "Because you never asked intelligent questions," she replied coldly. The inspector flushed. Miss Marple concealed a faint smile behind her teacup. Graves examined the photograph closely. "Who is she?" "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" The inspector looked unconvinced. Miss Marple intervened quietly. "My dear Inspector, sometimes ignorance is genuine, particularly where charming men are concerned." Graves grunted skeptically. But Miss Marple herself was studying the torn edge of the photograph, not the missing woman, the cut itself. Careful, made with sharp scissors, another tiny detail. Another indication of patience. Suddenly she asked, "Inspector, where exactly was Gerald Pike arrested?" The abrupt change startled him. "At the station." "No, before that." "Where was he found?" "In his lodgings above the Blue Boar." "And was he packing?" Graves blinked. "Yes, actually." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Of course." Elspeth turned from the window. "You think Gerald intended to run?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "But not because he murdered Ambrose Vale." A silence followed. Then Graves said heavily, "Good God, are we back to this again?" Miss Marple ignored him. Instead she asked, "Did Pike know about the false passport?" "We don't know." "But if he did," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "then he may have realized something dreadful." Elspeth stared at her. "What?" Miss Marple looked down at the torn photograph once more. Then she said very quietly, "That Ambrose Vale may never have intended anyone else to survive his departure.